Thank you so much for joining us for our last What's Happening in Washington for 2025. It's hard to believe we're at the end of the year already, but we are. And my, what a year in government and politics it has been. So, certainly no lack of excitement. My name is Katie Collins. I'm a vice president at G2G. I'll be moderating today as Liz is at ARPA-H doing some meetings with leadership, which is really exciting. So she'll have a report out on that for all of you later. But I'm joined by my colleague here at G2G, Chris Cooper. He's a director of government affairs at our firm, a former chief of staff on Capitol Hill, and he's going to be sharing some insights on everything that's going on. And then I hope we'll be joined by Chris Oates, who's the founder of Legislata and also a professor at Boston University. So Chris, I'll let you introduce yourself first. I can give a little bit of a background on me, and then we'll dive into our conversation.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. Pleased to join you this afternoon, this morning, depending on where you're at in the world. As Katie said, my name is Chris Cooper. I am a director in G2G's Washington, D.C. office. My background is on Capitol Hill. Before I joined the firm, I spent about a dozen years or so on Capitol Hill, specifically on the House side, working for two Republicans from Northeast Ohio who both served on the House Appropriations Committee. So, during my time, I kind of worked my way up almost every typical position in a congressional office from, the person that greets people all the way up to, as she said, chief of staff and the top staffer in the office working on appropriations issues. So, pleased to be with you today and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Chris. And I'm Katie Collins. And looking at the attendee list, I think I know a lot of you. But for those of you who I don't know, I've been at G2G for about 5 years. My background is in healthcare policy. I spent 6 years in the Obama White House. I was the policy staffer on the original Cancer Moonshot, and then the program director at the Biden Cancer Initiative before moving over and doing congressional advocacy on behalf of the National Institutes of Health. So I love everything related to health and science policy, and we're going to get into a lot of that today. So I think we should, start with what's been on the top of lots of folks' mind, which is the budget for FY26. I'd say normally we have a budget right now, for the current fiscal year, but that's not always the case. Things often get punted, into the calendar year. So Chris, could you talk a little bit about where we stand with funding the government? I think everybody's aware we've had a very prolonged shutdown earlier in the fall as a result of differences in opinion on the ACA premiums. But what is the current status? We've seen some movement in the House and the Senate. So, what do you think the next month and a half or so will look like when it comes to our budget?
Sure. Yeah. So as Katie said, we had a record-setting government shutdown end last month in November. You saw things like disruptions in air travel, food assistance, and other federal services. So the deal that Congress passed in November to end the shutdown did include three of the 12 what we consider annual spending bills that cover the different federal departments and agencies. Specifically included in that deal were the bills that fund the Department of Agriculture and the FDA, the bill that funds the VA and military construction activities, and then the spending bill that controls sort of congressional spending. It's called the legislative branch bill, and it, sets the various spending levels for congressional offices and related activities. So just to take it back to, earlier this year, the Senate and House Appropriations committees were moving through sort of their typical, process of considering annual spending bills. The Senate Appropriations Committee held markups on 8 of the 12 annual spending bills and passed those overwhelmingly in a bipartisan manner. I think typically they might have, had one or two members of the Senate vote against them in committee. In contrast, the House Appropriations Committee completed markups on all 12 of those spending bills, but in advancing those bills, they were done mostly on party lines. So they included more partisan, sort of what we would call riders or policy initiatives that, caused the minority party, in this case, the Democrats, to end up voting against passage of the bill when it's voted on in committee. For the past few weeks, House and Senate appropriators have been working to put together what we call a minibus, or basically just a grouping of a handful of spending bills. Their goal has been to get that done and passed and signed into law before Congress leaves for the holidays. And they've been discussing various, spending bills to be included in that action this month, including bills that fund the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education, the Defense Department, or the Department of War, depending on who you're talking to, the Transportation Department, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Interior Department, the Commerce Department. So they're looking at what can they basically pass here before the end of the calendar year on the spending side. And the Senate in particular has struggled to secure the consent from senators that's necessary to advance a five-bill proposal. And what we're seeing is basically there's opposition from a few GOP senators who have concerns with congressionally directed spending projects, otherwise known as earmarks, in the various bills, and then also concerns with some of the overall spending levels in the bills. So, Senate leadership, as a result of that, has not been able to, so far, to move this next spending bill package through the Senate floor. But they still are trying to find a way to do that before they head home for the holidays. I will say, the idea of stripping the earmarks or the congressionally directed spending projects from these bills is a non-starter for lawmakers on both sides of the political aisle. Um, a number of them request this type of funding and are set to receive, millions of dollars for sort of top priority projects in their districts or states. So, um, even if there were some sort of vote on removing those projects from these bills, that would not be successful. Um, but as I said, there's kind of a real possibility that Congress returns from the holidays facing another partial government shutdown. The current continuing resolution that again was passed in November to reopen the government is set to expire on January 30th. So when you factor in the holidays there and some of the other priorities that Congress will seek to address in the coming weeks, that doesn't leave a whole lot of
Yeah.
time to come up with a new spending package and finalize the FY26 spending bills.
We have Chris Oates here. Chris, you want to say hi and introduce yourself? I gave just a few pieces about your background at the top of the call and said you'd be joining us, but I'll turn it over to you and then you can chime in on our what the heck's going to happen with the budget conversation.
Sure. Yeah, thank you everyone. Sorry, I was late. I now have a newly updated Zoom, so that's nice. Um,
Always at the best time, isn't it?
exactly. So my background is I'm a political risk analyst, so always about forecasting rather than covering necessarily what is happening. We always said we're pundits, but we actually are supposed to be accurate. And I've worked on ballot campaigns and have a startup called Legislata, which aims to basically compete with Politico pro Bloomberg government, but to do it in a Substack way. So one day, hopefully, we'll get some journalists and maybe folks on this call to be sharing their analysis on our platform. And very happy to be here to talk to about what's going on in Washington because I certainly always enjoy these because I get to hear from Chris about what is going to happen and happy to share my own insights.
Well, that's great. So before we go away from approbes, Chris Oates, what do you think? Are we going to see anything? Are they going to meet this end of January deadline, or are we going to punt this again?
So I think it'll be a punt. It'll be a short-term thing. I think what we saw with the government shutdown is that um, the Senate Democrats, there's enough of them that don't want to do shutdowns. They did the shutdown. They kind of won, they kind of lost. But as they get into January, at the end of January, I think the question will be like, what's the point of another shutdown? What is the messaging bill going to be? People are gearing up for reelection campaigns, so there will be pressure to do it. But I would expect that the eight that voted in favor of that will vote again for a continuing resolution. I think to me the question is, does the Senate majority try to push through something extremely partisan that even Angus King of Maine could say, "Well, I just can't vote for that." I doubt they will. I think over the past, not just now, but over the past few years, a lot of senators have basically, and members of the House have basically accepted that continuing resolutions are the way to go, and we're going to stick with mostly baselines, and we're not going to do anything big. We'll do the big stuff in like the big reconciliation bills and not in the budgets. But again, who knows what could happen between now and January? Many different things could happen, which would lead the Senate to say the Senate Democratic Caucus to say we can't vote for this because ultimately that is who makes the decisions on a government shutdown these days.
So speaking of, we won't vote for this and things that have to be done or should be done by January, let's talk a little bit about healthcare and the ACA. As we mentioned at the top of this call, that is what really drove the shutdown, despite the fact that the government has been reopened for over a month now. We still have no progress on those premiums on healthcare. I mean, I know I saw my premium jump. I think that's common for lots of folks who use the marketplace. Today, the Senate is voting on dueling bills. Likely both of them will go nowhere. So I would love it if each of you, could maybe both share a prediction of what you think will happen, and then maybe share, we have a Republican and a Dem on here, the different parties' perspectives on healthcare and maybe what is driving their decisions in this area. So, Chris Cooper, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, and as you alluded to there, as part of that government reopening deal last month, the Senate Majority Leader John Thune did promise the chamber's Democrats a vote this month on separate legislation to extend those expiring COVID era ACA enhanced premium tax credits. And just as a reminder, the enhancements are set to expire at the end of this calendar year. They made the tax credits both larger and more available to people of higher income levels. So, as Katie mentioned, there are going to be two votes happening today. I think they may actually even be starting to move forward on the votes right now as we're meeting. The first one of the votes is on the Senate Democrat proposal to extend the enhanced subsidies for 3 years. Um, the Senate is also expected to vote on a Republican plan to basically provide health savings account deposits of different amounts for individuals who have high deductible plans and earn um, less than, I think it's around 700% of the federal poverty level. As Katie said, neither of those proposals are expected to receive sufficient support, or, in this case, in the Senate, 60 votes today. So, it sounds like the next step is going to be the House GOP preparing some sort of healthcare framework to give Republicans in that chamber something to vote on next week before they leave for the holidays. Again, as we're getting closer to the enhanced subsidies expiring. Um, from everything I'm seeing, that House framework that they're working on is not expected to include a temporary extension of the ACA credits. And so, because there's been sort of no real major progress in either chamber, you're starting to see some of the GOP members craft their own proposals. I know there's, different proposals from moderates to extend the credits, including a sort of modified 2-year proposal from um, Representative Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, um, Senators Susan Collins from Maine and Bernie Moreno from Ohio have also released a bill to try to provide sort of a 2-year glide path off the subsidies, setting some income limits on who can receive them, and also instituting a sort of minimum per month premium. So, look, I think it's tough politically for several Republicans. Um, it I can't remember who said the quote, but there's something I really like that's basically there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. And so, these credits were set to expire at the end of this year. They were enacted with only Democrat support during the COVID era, but politically, I don't see how moderate Republicans can sort of not extend them or have something real that people feel as they're getting closer to the midterms. And, typically in midterms, the party in power tends to suffer. And I think they'll be looking for taking certain actions that can try to limit their sort of losses as they're getting closer to the midterms next year.
Thanks, Chris Oates.
Yes. So I think the shutdown was really interesting because it was about healthcare in the same way that when I argue with my wife about the dishes, it's not really about the dishes. Like
Yes,
that
we've
was
all
the
been there.
thing. Yeah, like that's the thing that the Democrats could agree, oh, this is what we're fighting on. It wasn't really. It was basically the Democratic Party did not want to continue to fund the Trump administration, and continue to go along with that. That this was the one vote they had all of 2025. Well, I guess they did in March as well, and theoretically you do on the National Defense Authorization Act, but basically Chuck Schumer didn't want to do it in March. No one wants to do it against the NDAA because then you're taking money from the
Right.
troops. So basically, they had one vote. Like this was the one time that they had leverage. And even though they said it was about healthcare subsidies, there was actually, if you remember, if you were like really in the weeds in September, there was a big debate about whether that was too easy of an ask. Because what if you're the Democratic senator and you say we are going to fight for healthcare subsidies, and then John Thune says, "Okay, here you go." Do you fold? Do you back down? You say, do you accept the win? When you really wanted to have a real big government shutdown to show the difference. It went way better for Democrats than they expected. A lot of them were secretly surprised that John Thune didn't just offer them that at the beginning. And I think
Or
that
that
does.
Trump didn't come in and want to save it. That's what I thought was going to happen.
Yeah, it was really weird. It was in a sense like if you think that your downstairs neighbor is really bad, it's like sending a hungry person to your downstairs neighbor and say, "I bet they're too mean to give them some food." You kind of and then you're like, "Oh wait, they're probably just going to give them food," and then I look bad.
Right.
Um, I've used a lot of domestic analogies in this. Sorry, but that what really was interesting there was that it didn't go, and I think to me that showed to Democrats that Republicans really care about this in an ideological manner that they do not believe in Obamacare. They've opposed it for 16 years. There is not the appetite to do this, and that's what I think complicates it because I think, as Chris Cooper says, absolutely there is a majority in the House and the Senate for this sort of thing because there are some Republicans that would split off both in the House and the Senate. Would it actually get to the floor, or would Mike Johnson worry about his speakership going up in the air if he does it? John Thune, I think, is a little bit more secure. Um, but that's where I think it's going to go. I also think Democrats, while they care about this, don't care so much that they want to bail out Republicans. Because there is also the sense of why would we? Yes, it's going to be bad for a lot of people for 1 year, that their premiums are going to go up, but that is not our fault. That's the fault of the majority party. They're the ones governing the country. And should we really go out of our way if they don't want to do this? When
Yeah.
they can do this, people can get angry. They're going to lose even more. So I think what you're seeing with the compromise for the shutdown of the vote, I think everyone knew it's not actually going to pass, or the vote won't pass. Maybe something else would, but that wouldn't. And I think they were kind of fine with that. I think it benefits Republicans who genuinely don't believe in this as fiscally responsible. I think it benefits Democrats who think that this will be politically beneficial to them. Now, would something else happen with some other compromise? I think that's very plausible. And I think one of and we might start to see that in January or February. And as Chris Cooper said, maybe a glide path or something else, because I think this is a really interesting part just in terms of healthcare overall and where we go long term. If you're thinking about where the American healthcare system is going to go, it's really a patchwork. And I blame Harry Truman for that, not getting his version of the NHS through, because we basically have created socialized medicine for low income people and those over 65. We have a giant tax subsidy if you get it through your employer because that's tax deductible, and that's actually what led us into this mess in World War II. Healthcare became tax deductible because of price controls. And then, so that basically, that's the situation that Obamacare confronted of the very poor have healthcare provided by the government. The very old have healthcare provided by the government. Maybe not the very old, 65 is young these years. And if you get it through your employer, you get a subsidy. And so Obamacare was trying to fill the gap that happened, but it never filled it quite completely. It expanded Medicare. It created these marketplaces. It had some support for those on low income, but not quite low enough for Medicaid. And what the enhanced subsidies were trying to do was to increase that a little bit more, to basically raise that level. They've gone back down. So what I think this shows really is that there is an instability in just the healthcare system overall. And what I would expect to see is, as you said, a temporary thing becomes permanent. I would expect to see us basically create over the next 5 years if Democrats come into office. And I think this whole debate really shaped it into a quasi Medicare for all through a variety of different programs, including employer-based health. Because I think maybe they'll do enhanced subsidies now, or they might do it in 2029, and then those expire, or people start complaining about those at just the other threshold of that, and then they creep. So I think this is a really interesting case study of where we're going long term for American healthcare, because the second you take away a little bit of support, it becomes a really big political deal.
And if we're back here in the first quarter in early 2026, this will be a topic to discuss then, to see if any of these moderate proposals were able to get support as we're starting to see some, Republicans potentially back away from the party line because of the impact on their political future. And we'll be getting into a midterm year. And I'm guessing Republicans don't want to have done nothing on this leading into next November. So I guess we can put a pin in this and talk about it in 2026. I'd like to really get into the political side of things, but before we do that, Chris Cooper, we've had a question in the chat about the reauth for the SBIR, STTR program, which lapsed on October 1st. That has big impact across industry. Would you talk a little bit about the future of that? We have different bills in the House and in the Senate, and nothing has moved. So would you share just status and potential path forward for SBIRs, please?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. And for those of you who, don't know or aren't following it closely, so the SBIR, or the Small Business Innovative Research Program, was established, I think, back in the 80s, basically to increase participation of small innovative companies in federally funded R&D. And then in the 90s, a complementary program called the Small Business Technology Transfer Program was created to help facilitate basically the commercialization of university and federal R&D by small companies. So since those original authorizations, the programs have been extended several times. I think most recently it was back in September of 2022 um, that Congress extended the authority for the programs through September of 2025. So the SBIR, STTR authorization did lapse on October 1st. And as a result, we're seeing things like all new funding opportunities are sort of frozen until Congress reauthorizes the programs. Some agencies, I think the NIH is a good example, have already announced early expiration of funding opportunities as a result of the lapse. So, there are sort of competing congressional proposals to reauthorize the programs. In September, before the lapse occurred, the House unanimously passed what we tend to call a clean 1 year extension of the programs. Again, there was no opposition in the House to that vote. It was sent to the Senate. Um, Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa, who is the Senate Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee chair, objected to the attempt in the Senate to quickly pass the bill and send it to the president for signature. She listed some of the reasons that she opposed it and tried to pass her own reauthorization proposal, which is called the Innovate Act. Um, that includes sort of more major changes to the programs. I think one of the examples that um, is thrown around, it would put a lifetime cap on combined phase one and phase two funding per organization, and that would include any like subsidiaries and spinouts. Um, More recently, Senator Ernst attempted to include her proposal, again, it's called the Innovate Act, in the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA. She was kind of trying to do it behind the scenes, which the other three top corners of the Small Business Committee didn't appreciate. Her attempt to kind of bypass typical bipartisan negotiations to reauthorize the program. So the NDA was released on Sunday, and her, you know, attempt to reauthorize the programs through her proposal was not included. There was no clean extension included in the NDAA, so that was really seen as sort of the best opportunity to include a extension of the programs this calendar year. Um, Obviously, pressure is growing on Congress to extend the programs. I know they're hearing from, a number of entities, their staff are, about, impacts in their states or districts as a result of the authorization lapsing. So I do think, they'll continue to try to work toward a agreement, and that congressional leadership will bring that to the floor quickly once a deal is reached. But I do think that will be one of their kind of higher priorities in the new year.
Chris Oates, anything to add about SBAR?
No, that was a
All
great
right.
answer.
Well, thanks, Chris Cooper. So let's dive into politics. We are moving into an election year. Very exciting. It's felt, to me at least, throughout 2025, that fear of Trump has kept Republicans in line. It sure kept them in line for the one big beautiful bill. We have seen poll ratings fall for him. We've seen Republicans take a beating in the elections last month, or at least maybe not had the results that they would have in the past. We've seen Marjorie Taylor Greene, very visibly break from Trump on the Epstein files and on healthcare, the backlash that she faced, and then her resignation. So all that to say, how is the change in the Republican Party, the potential change in Trump's positive polling, how is that going to affect the coming year? What do we think as we get into the midterms, the future of MAGA and the Republican Party? Both of you, I would love your thoughts on the landscape here.
Sure. Well, I'll start because Chris just had a masterful answer. Give him time to compose himself. So I think what's really interesting is I remember talking to folks after the 2024 election, and some of them were saying like, "Oh my, this is a shift. This is a restructuring of the American electorate." And I remember thinking, like, I don't think that's true because if you look globally, there was a backlash. It was the worst year for incumbent parties in 100 years. The Democratic Party actually did better. They were like among the best losers of it. And so that would indicate that this is likely to happen. Donald Trump ran in 2024 against inflation, against the personal approval ratings of Joe Biden. I think Kamala Harris didn't have enough time to define herself. I think it'd be really interesting counterfactual if Biden had dropped out a year earlier. Could Kamala Harris have done a Mark Carney style thing where Justin Trudeau was incredibly unpopular in Canada, but then there was a reset to Mark Carney? The landscape kind of changed and he was able to define himself. So I think what we saw in 2024 was a Republican win, but it was much more of a backlash to the Biden presidency and inflation at the time, which would indicate that not only would there be your typical midterm defeat for the incumbent party, but it would be particularly bad. And I remember talking to people who said, no, Donald Trump's really popular now. And I was like, I don't think he is. I think he was out of people's minds for a while. And what
Mhm.
we've seen is has kind of validated that Donald Trump's become much less popular. His party is now, I think, much more driven towards him personally. If you remember the first term, it was a bit like a hostile takeover of an institution because he came in the primaries. Most institutional Republicans did not support him. They abandoned him briefly after the Access Hollywood tape. They kind of assumed he was going to lose and they just wanted to minimize their losses. So there was that real sense of, if you remember, the adults in the room in his cabinet, basically they were going to babysit him and they would use him like the carnival barker who goes out and does the rallies, but they kind of wanted to usher him to the side after a while. That's no longer the case. Right now, he is in charge of the party. The party is held together in many ways by him. And even though are huge divisions within the party, from Mitch McConnell wanting more aid to Ukraine to J.D. Vance, a neo-isolationist, they're all kind of held together, many of them, by fear of being turned on by him. And so then that raised the question of what happens with both in the midterms and also what happens if he starts to decline over the next year. I think in the midterms, it's very clear Democrats will win the House. As long as there's not some extreme gerrymandering or anything that we're not foreseeing. The Senate is a lot tougher because it does get down to individual candidates and states. But I think over the next year, what we're likely to see as well as just the generic ballot, is what is going on with Donald Trump's health. Does it decline? If you are uh, if you are being seen by doctors for cognitive tests this frequently, that is not a good sign. Obviously, we can't diagnose what is happening, but the best explanation I have, and I have doctors in my family, is that he's on some sort of Alzheimer's drug, which would explain the hand bruising because that's where maybe the IV went in. And if you do that, you have to do multiple MRIs to see what's going on. So the health is probably going to decline over the next year. That would mean that there's more vacuum within that cabinet, more people like J.D. Vance, Stephen Miller, Driscoll at Defense, Hegseth to start to freelance. That tends to pull things apart. And then to me, the real question is, what does it mean for Republicans in Congress? If you are a Republican in California that's going to be gerrymandered out of your reelection, do you start to rebel a little bit? Do you start to set yourself up for a post-Trump world? I don't know the answer to that, but that's the thing I'm going to be seeing. I don't know if Marjorie Taylor Greene was the first domino in that effect, or if she is just a sui generis person. Um, but that would be what I'm looking for: is does Mike Johnson have a harder time getting anything passed? Do senators start to push back? We're already seeing with Hegseth on the Caribbean strikes that might be happening. And I think, therefore, what is the Republican Party going to be doing? And I would say probably it will be kind of fighting for control of the future of the Republican Party by any of the main contenders, with Donald Trump gradually checking out either for health reasons or just because he's a lame duck and ambitious politicians are looking to the next election.
And before I go to Chris Cooper, Chris Oates, I want to ask you, do you see any of those, contenders, the JD Vances of the world as being able to have the same kind of sway over the American people and the Republican Party that Donald Trump has?
No, I should mention, just because it is hard to be objective, I actively dislike JD Vance. And I say that because I think it is a true
Appreciate your
that
honesty.
you have to admit your biases. And so, there are people I disagree with politically, but someone who has a whole idea about heritage Americans, I just find that to be repulsive. But I do try to be objective that he is my age and he's the vice president of the United States. So clearly there's something that he knows how to do very
We're
well.
doing wrong that he's doing,
Yes.
doing
Yes. I
right.
mean, he's much more, I dislike him, but he is much more professionally successful than me. I have to admit that. I think, though, the thing is, and this is what I've always found to be unique about Donald Trump, is he was a celebrity before he was a politician, and he was a celebrity in a time of monoculture. It is hard, I think, maybe for people who are really politically engaged, to recognize just how much in so many voters' minds Donald Trump is the star of The Apprentice.
Yeah.
And he was seen as a kind of nonpartisan, just good at business, successful person. And there have been plenty of people like that. Silvio Berlusconi in Italy was the same way. When he started, it was, I'm an incredibly successful businessman and I can just fix things. It was somewhat of a Mitt Romney when Mitt Romney was governor, Larry Hogan in Maryland, that kind of I'm not in the system, I'm not political. And that is something that is really hard to capture for anyone who came up through politics, like J.D. Vance or Rubio or any of the other ones, Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz. If you come up through politics, you don't get to have that aura of celebrity around you first. And so to me, I think the thing is, does the Republican Party do a kind of standard politician, and does that work? Because that obviously could, we only have two parties. So you could have a J.D. Vance win the next election. That's perfectly reasonable. Or do they look to a celebrity type figure? I don't know who that could be, but you could easily see for example, I don't know if Peyton Manning is a Republican, but
Mhm.
if I were the Republican
Yep.
Party, I would be
Yeah.
saying like, is there a former NFL quarterback who
Where's Arnold Schwarzenegger?
exactly? Arnold Schwarzenegger
Yeah,
is a great example of that, and so that to me is, do they go with the Donald Trump type? Not ideologically, but in terms of what I
right.
think his true strength was, is that a lot of people trusted him who weren't engaged in politics.
That's fascinating. Thanks, Chris. Chris
Yeah.
Oates, Chris Cooper, over to you on the midterms and the future of the Republican Party.
Yeah, I would just say the one thing Democrats are going to have a hard time calling out Trump's cognitive abilities given what happened with Biden toward the end of his presidency. So I will say, I mean,
Yes, but
Republicans,
hypocrisy is easy. It
it
is
is.
easy to be
It's
hypocrites.
true.
So yeah, yeah.
Um, I mean, it's going to be tough. Midterm elections, when you control both houses of Congress and the presidency, um, I'm sure they're going to have a tough time defending a number of seats. Obviously, Chris talked about, redistricting. I think when that's all said and done, Republicans will probably have gained at least a handful of seats compared to Democrat redistricting efforts.
Mhm.
Most, not most, but many blue states like California have independent commissions. Most Republican states still have the state legislature maintaining authority over redistricting. So I do think that when that's all kind of settled, it could have a real difference in at least the margins of majority in the House, if not, who is outright controlling the House. As far as Trump's sort of like power in the party, I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene used to be one of his staunchest defenders in Congress. Um, but, most recently kind of pushed back on him in a couple areas, one being the Epstein file release, the other being calling for an extension of the temporary ACA enhanced credits. Um, and so, he is still very powerful within the party, and if you go against him, he's going to come for you. I think we've seen that in a number of instances, and now she's heading for the exits. I think each Republican will have to sort of make their own decision what is worth going against the president, against the party, against Speaker Johnson, and what is not. And that's going to be a decision made by each member of Congress. My guess is that they will do so only in a couple instances. They're not going to wholesale all of a sudden sort of start trashing Trump and Speaker Johnson and all that. But they have to play their districts. And so whatever issue or two, and you're seeing this right now with the healthcare subsidy debate, there's some moderates that are, thinking that that is the thing they want to stand on and that they want to be out in front of against what is probably more the party's position on whether or not to extend the credits. So it'll probably be, I mean, it'll be a tough year. But I think some of these redistricting efforts are going to help sort of stem that. I don't think it will be some like overwhelming blue wave where they have a super majority in the House. Most of these districts are drawn so partisanly at this point that it's a pretty narrow number of seats that are really truly up in play. Um, and so if it flips, then they're going to have maybe a little bit more margin, but still will have a narrow enough majority that they won't be able to kind of force things through easily, depending on how effective their leadership is in twisting arms.
Thank you. I want to ask, and then maybe we'll get into some time for Q&A, but just on the, idea of a midterm year, the economy is often the voting issue for folks. So Chris Oates, I know you have an incredible economics background. Would you talk to us a little bit about the state of the US economy? I think depending on what side you're listening to, we're hearing that the economy is fabulous and, going great. From the other side, we're hearing that tariffs, that we haven't seen the full impact of tariffs, that manufacturers have been eating that cost, that after the holidays, we're really going to be feeling the full impact of rising household costs. So what do you foresee, going into 2026 for the state of the economy, and how do you see that playing into the fall of 2026 elections?
Well, I think the Federal Reserve rate cut yesterday and the discussion around it really shows the questionable state of the economy. And I mean that in the sense of it is a real question, because on the one hand, we do see a little bit higher than expected inflation. I believe it was around 3% rather than the target of 2%, but that's not crazy. That's okay, and it might be on a glide path downwards. But we are seeing weakness in the labor market. Layoffs are up, job churn is down. The quits rate, which usually is a good sign, is down, and unemployment is slightly higher than it was. To me, I think the real question we have right now is what are the fundamentals of the economy? Because in at least the first half of the year, a lot of economic growth could be attributed to the rise of data center build out. And you've probably seen the numbers, they're just like ridiculous. They're basically, if you just said, I'm going to spend $1 gazillion on data centers, that's about as close as we get. A lot of those promises aren't necessarily going to be kept. So, for example, when OpenAI says we're aiming for like 5 gigawatts of data centers in the next 5 years, like there's not enough stuff to build that. Like we don't have enough grid transmission. New data centers are being blocked because they don't have enough power to be sourced for them. Believe the PGM utility, which is in the kind of the Midwest area, said if you want to build a data center, you have to bring your power along with it. It's one reason why the Grok data center, training center in Memphis, is building its own gas turbines, which is leading to its own issues. But I think what that means is that if the data center build out starts to sputter, and if, for example, we see a real contraction, it could be something like a new DeepSeek release of a cheap AI model. It could be just investors start getting wary. Bubbles can be kind of self-perpetuating, both on the upside and the downside. We could see a real decline in the economy, or what we could see over the next year is the gains from AI productivity start to materialize. These AI companies start to get revenue. So even if there's a couple companies that go down, even if valuations go down, it doesn't affect the broader economy. And as things just kind of keep chugging along, and the economy is big enough and resilient enough to recover from tariffs. So I think, especially when we talk about tariffs and actual policy from Washington, it is important to remember we are talking about a change to what otherwise would have happened. So it's not that you implement tariffs and then a financial crisis hits and we go into recession. It's that we would have been at 2% GDP growth, and with tariffs we're going to be at 1.8%. So it matters, but in terms of politics and what people feel, it does seem like there are going to be specific things around housing affordability in certain markets, electricity prices in certain markets that'll be driven by data centers, and then a broader kind of rise or decline in the unemployment rate and real wage growth. But an important thing to note just about the politics of economics is that that tends to be crystallized around like April or May of an election year. And what happens after that isn't seen as much unless it's a big crisis. So I think where we are over the next 6 months is going to determine what that means for voters in the next election.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left. We have a question in the chat, actually two questions I want to get to. So first, and then maybe we close out a little bit on the tests and expansions of executive power if we have a few minutes. But I want to address, Chris, questions about why there's objection to reauthorizing SBIR? Like, is there an ideological issue there, or how come we're not seeing that move forward, especially with the impact that NIH has said it will have on their grant making ability?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's not an ideological opposition to SBIR. Chair Ernst has come up with a number of reforms that she's seeking that, in her view, would strengthen the program, and get it back on track to focusing on what are truly small businesses and, um, further disentangling U.S. interests from adversary entities and things like that. So I don't think that there's some like ideological opposition to extending the programs. I think she's announced that she's not going to be seeking re-election. She's currently the chair of the Senate Small Business Committee. This is her chance to kind of put her stamp as she sees it on the SBIR program. And if they keep doing little extensions, then that removes the incentive and the urgency for Congress to act on a more long-term basis that has some of her reforms included. And so, um, I think they'll come to an agreement. I think the pressure will build to the point that they'll have to come to some sort of agreement. And again, because it's so popular across the country, I think they'll try to move it quickly once they've reached that.
Thank you. All right, for Chris Oates, we have a question in the chat. It looks like RFK is dismantling US public health, which will lead to increased morbidity and mortality, most notably increased infectious disease. What do you think RFK's real objective is? Before I turn that to you, I will say that I spent last week in Atlanta at the American Epilepsy Society conference with 5,000 neurologists and got lots of explanations about how a brain worm works. So if you want to include the brain worm in your explanation, you can. But, what do you think his objective is, given all of the, honestly, anti-science determinations that have come out of CDC recently?
Well, I think if you look over his career, I think he truly believes that um, big big ag, big pharma, chemicals like damage people. He came out of the environmental movement, and back in the 70s when the environmental movement was very much kind of came out of look at how bad pesticides are. And pesticides, DDT, the thalidomide cases, there was a real, at the time, I think, justified concern about industrial chemicals. And I think that's really his through line. It's a real kind of organic focused, skepticism about doctors, skepticism about big medicine, all of that. And I think that is metastasized into where he is now, where he's against vaccines because if vaccines are promoted by doctors and you can't trust doctors, then you don't trust vaccines. I think he is a true fanatic in the sense of he's a believer in what he believes, and I think also in part it can't be underestimated that he is a Kennedy. If you remember, if you saw the news story, like his application to Harvard, he wrote his name. Like his essay of why should I get into Harvard, he wrote his name. I went to actually college. I did study abroad with his son, RFK the third,
Wow.
and who was I most recently saw him on Mike Lindell's TV network, and like I mean Bobby, I don't want to judge people on how they were in college, but like Bobby was different. He was separate from all the rest of us. There was a sense that if you are a Kennedy and that is your name, you experience the world differently than the rest of us do. He didn't show up to class and he still took the exam and did fine. And I think if you grow up as your dad was RFK and was assassinated and everyone treats you differently and as you see with the scandal with Olivia Nuzzi, I don't think he's a normal person. I don't think he ever had a normal life. Maybe he didn't have the chance to have a normal life. He was a heroin addict. He had a diary of all the women he had affairs with. I think those of us on this call who are rational individuals trying to put rationality into him are barking up the wrong tree. I think we need to recognize that. I think the real question is, what is Bill Cassidy, the senator from Louisiana, ever going to do? And what would happen to do that? Because that really is that's the future of American public health policy. It's not what RFK does. It's who are the people around him who would one day stop him.
Well, and also, what does it mean for Bill Cassidy's political future, if anything? Because it doesn't seem that folks are talking about the fact that RFK is in the position he is in because because Bill Cassidy gave him the thumbs up. Um, interesting to see if there will be any blowback there. Chris
I
Cooper,
I was just going to say this is an example of what I was talking about, where Republicans are going to have to kind of pick and choose where and how much they want to raise issues with the administration. So, Bill Cassidy is from Louisiana. That is a Republican state. But at the same time, he is a physician and raised a number of issues that he had um, when Kennedy was going through the confirmation process. And more recently, he's made some comments raising issue with some of the decisions that those vaccine panels and others have made, coming at it again from his physician background. I'm sure that they're just having internal conversations like, hey, I think this is wrong, but how far is he going to go in pointing that out? Is he going to give a quote? In some cases, is he going to send a letter or call for him to testify? At some point, does he call for him to be removed? I think that's just an ongoing sort of internal conversation that he's probably having with his team about like, and depending on how far I go, what does that mean for Trump and Republican supporters back in Louisiana, and how will they view me as I look to get reelected? So.
Yeah. Real
thank you.
profile and courage right there.
Yeah, right.
I'm not that that's not
There's
like that's
not
Bill
many
Cassidy. That's
anymore.
everyone.
On
Like
either
that's
side, there's not
everyone.
many
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah, that's everyone. I mean, I remember at the time when Biden was after the debate, like calling up my member of Congress to be like, "Hey, I think the president should step aside," and then waiting for that. And it was exactly the same thing. People were like, "Well, what if he stays in, and what if he wins? Would this member be frozen out of the White House?" And I'm like, "That's not what I care about right now." But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like that's the calculation that every one of them is doing.
All right, we have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to ask both of you. We'll start with Chris Oates. What are you paying closest attention to as we go into 2026? What are you going to be looking for in January, to kind of set the precedent for the year ahead in both policy and politics?
So for me, I'm going to go a little left field. I'm really paying attention to the information environment and do we start to see cracks there? Because I think to me, the biggest change from now to 10 or 15 years ago has been the decline in local news, the rise of algorithmic media, and the ability for therefore people to exist in bubbles. And I think, for
Yeah.
example, the reason why RFK is in the position he is in is because anti-vaccine sentiment grew over years, not in mainstream media, but on that. So do we start to see that change? For example, TikTok users are down year over year. Instagram, I believe, is up, but is still down. Do we start to see states propose regulating social media? Australia just did it for under 16s. Do we start to see a rise in local media again, or do we see consolidation of the cable industry? So for me, it's really, does the right wing information bubble persist? Does it start to crack? And is it also going to be matched with a left wing information bubble with its own things? Or do we get more to a more unified media where news organizations start to figure out how to do social media? So that's not something that will happen in January or February, but I think the midterms are going to be a really interesting case study of do we start to do we continue to see multiple different realities reflected in our information environment, or does everyone start to get back to, well, this is the polling result, and that filtrates everywhere?
Thank you. Chris Cooper.
Yeah, I'll take it two directions. On the congressional front, one thing I'm really interested in is are Republicans going to try to pursue a second reconciliation package after they did the one big beautiful bill in 2025? There seems to be some appetite. I think Lindsey Graham was interviewed a couple days ago and called for some sort of second reconciliation package. But then on the flip side, the president has kind of said that they accomplished what they were seeking to accomplish through one big beautiful bill. So that is one thing I'm looking
It
at.
was perfect. We
Do
don't
they
need
try
another
to
one.
do they try to come up with some second reconciliation package? And then I guess looking at Supreme Court and presidential power, it looks like the Supreme Court is likely going to side with the administration in his firing of the FTC commissioner, and kind of showing a inclination to allow presidents to fire certain leaders of independent agencies. And then on the flip side, I think the administration is getting a little bit of a more cold response from the Supreme Court on tariffs and whether the president can use um, a statute allowing the president to regulate importation and exportation once a national emergency is declared. Questioning whether that authorizes the tariff regime that the president has put into place. I think that that could be one where they side against the administration, and if they do so, the government will own. I think the latest estimate was close to $100 billion in some sort of refunds, and would upend the trade negotiations that have been ongoing. So those are a couple of the things I'm looking at.
Yeah, we did not get into presidential power, which I had had on my list. So maybe again, first quarter 2026, that's a place we can start. Heartfelt thanks to both Chris's for joining us today. We are in the full throttle rush to the end of the year, so really appreciate you both taking the time. And thanks to everybody who joined us to listen in. So happy holidays, happy New Year. I hope everybody gets a bit of a break before we're right back at it in 2026. So thanks, everybody. Have a great one.